Hello, and firstly I'd like to say thank you all for coming tonight. I can really only say either you're very curious people or you can think for yourselves. Because as you've seen recently particularly, the government, they're not trying to convince you with studies, right? They're telling you what to think, okay? And even in the government documents, it's not just the media. We're hippies, we're Fruit Loops, anti-vaxxers, conspiracy theorists. And when they can't do that, they associate the freedom movement, which are the people looking at mandatory drugs, we're against mandatory drugs. So therefore, you'll see smear campaigns on the media, spotlight, showing the freedom movement that is associated with anti-mandates. We're sovereign citizens, and then they smear the sovereign citizens, or we're white supremacists, and Proud Boys, neo-Nazis, right-wings. All of that is what the media says. And, well, here I am. I'm actually a science teacher. That was where in the early 90s I was teaching science in the schools. And I didn't realise at the time, but I saw this increase in huge chronic illness. And what clicked for me was the principals saying, so tonight you have been hearing about all the different studies. Right now, the government knows that you don't want to be analysing different studies and learning all this science. They know that you can't determine the weight of evidence from these different studies. So they're not doing that. They're framing the debate for you. Vaccines are safe and effective. They've been tested for 10 years. We support immunisation. That is the mantra. That's what every parent got over the last 30 years when we presented to them the evidence of the increase in chronic illnesses in children. And that's what led me back to university. So what we're talking about is framing and these aren't my slides. Oh, sorry, that's right. So they're framing the debate for us, and they're using illusion. They've turned things upside down, and tonight I'm going to try and explain to you why you should be listening to the information provided by parents, and researchers, independent researchers, and some of the doctors that have woken up to this as well, as opposed to the government, whose advisory boards are now completely conflicted with industry interests. Over 50% of people on government advisory boards are receiving income from the industry. And if you look at the TGA, it's 98% of their funding comes from the TGA. From the pharmaceutical industry. So whose interests do you think they're protecting in public health policy? This is the thing. We have been told that the public health policies are for the community good and in our best interests. Well, the TGA admitted after COVID they don't have any duty of care to the public. But you weren't told that, were you? And so what can be protected in public health policy is both industry interests or the public's health, but you can't do both. But the TGA is responsible for both. They're responsible for approving the drugs and then monitoring the safety in the population. So do you think they have an incentive to monitor the health of the public when they're making profit from the drugs they approve? So in fact, they've never set up a proper surveillance system that will determine causal links with the vaccines. Now, I need to make a point here because we've had Dr. Philip Altman up today, and he's been a regulator for 40 years. He's only just discovered that because vaccines are classified. Now, vaccines are drugs, but they don't get tested in the same way as other normal drugs. And regulators didn't know that because they're classified under a different name. They're called biologics. A biologic, and if you ask what that definition is, they're told that you're told that they have organic material in them, biological material. Well, that's not exactly the case. The biologics refers to how they're manufactured. So even genetically engineered products, such as the COVID vaccines, can be called a biologic. Even the mRNA in the vaccine is not human mRNA, it is modified messenger RNA, genetically engineered. And that was allowed to be classified as a biologic and hence promoted to the public as a vaccine. But as you've heard from Dr. Wilyman, it's a countermeasure and a genetically engineered product that's experimental. So tonight I want to try and explain to you, instead of comparing studies, I want to go through the principles of health promotion to try and show you why mandatory vaccination. So even if you think there's a role for some vaccines, which is fine, it's your choice with informed information, mandatory vaccines is not only harmful, it's unethical and unnecessary. And the government is only convincing you through framing and creating an illusion about these drugs. All right, so this slide, this is the precautionary principle. Now, if you're going to design a public health policy that protects public interest, the public health, then you need to ensure that you've tested the safety of that drug for over 10 years. The precautionary principle states the burden of proof of harmlessness of any procedure or technology is on the proponent and not the general public. So with this genetically engineered COVID vaccine, they needed to have tested it for at least 5 to 10 years to find out the long-term consequences, because many of these autoimmune diseases and cancer, they come out months and years later, 10, 15 years. So if you want to protect human health, you've got to test that drug for at least 5 to 10 years. The COVID vaccines, the genetically engineered mRNA injections, which aren't vaccines, were tested actually for 2 months. And after that 2 months, they ensured that the placebo group also got the injections, the vaccines, so that all of that data was wiped out. And Dr. Wilyman showed you the deaths and illnesses that were produced during those trials. So it was only tested for 2 months, although they said it was 6 months. The data became available in December 2020, and it was promoted in 2021. So if you use this principle in reverse, which is what the government's doing, then you're protecting industry's interests, right? Because if the government's not proving that they're harmless before they promote them to the public, then you're protecting the profits that the industry is making from these drugs. So with respect to the precautionary principle, if it's not used in the right format in public health policy, then the government can ignore everything we're saying, right, and just tell you what is safe and effective, and then they use heuristics, rule of thumb, that's how the public is making their decisions on these vaccines, because you're deferring to the doctor. Right, so I'll explain that in my speech, but I would like to say that if I'm going to give you an overview of the principles of health promotion to show you why mandatory vaccination is against, is harming human health. And I will just quote Dr. Richard Harris, who was the Australian of the Year in 2019, and he did the rescues in the caves in Thailand. And he said, when there is uncertainty, people should be given all the information so they can make their own well-informed choices. That concept is at the core of living in a free world. So when drugs become mandatory in a population, that's your bodily autonomy, right? Quality of life. Once you've lost your quality of life, you've lost your freedom. And that's why this is so important. Next slide. Oh, sorry. Okay, so doctors must provide informed consent to vaccines without coercion, manipulation or pressure, right? That is the doctor's medical ethical guidelines. It's in their immunisation handbook. Doctors are all violating that with coercive vaccination that's been forced upon them by the government. But there's no jab, no pay and play. That's a federal policy. Doctors, as you saw there, it's the regulator APRA that is forcing them to violate their medical ethics, because if they speak of the risks of these particular drugs that are given to healthy people, they can be deregulated, deregistered. And many of them are in the courts at the moment, and they have been deregistered and others have committed suicide. These are the doctors trying to do the right thing, but the regulatory board, which is a corporate body, which is clearly protecting industry interests, right, is targeting doctors if they speak of the risks of vaccines. So coercion is against the ethical grid for health promotion, right? In health promotion, there are principles that you need, and one of them is that you don't coerce any medical intervention on a person, but particularly if they're healthy, because coercion results in stress and disease. Well-known fact. So again, that's a violation of their medical ethics. And here was Scott Morrison as the principal, as the Prime Minister, coercing the entire population with a genetically engineered, modified messenger RNA product. You can call it a gene therapy, but a therapy actually has some benefit. This doesn't have any benefit. Okay, now just a word on this policy, the no jab, no pay and play, right, that was put through social services. It's not a health, it wasn't put through the health department. And to put in mandatory policies, there's some rules. It needs to be for a legitimate public health purpose, right? For the no jab, no pay and play, there was no increased risk of any of these childhood diseases in 2015 when that bill went through, right? And the policy also has to be in proportion to the risk. Well, there was no extra risk. And it needs to be done in law, and that's health law. But Scott Morrison was in the Social Services Department in 2015, and he was the one that tabled the no jab, no pay. So this went through social services without any law in the Health Act, or any reason, legitimate reason for doing so. So the policy uses financial coercion for doctors and patients. Doctors actually receive an amount of money, a bonus money, for every vaccine that they give to children. Both are paid to promote and use vaccines. So money speaks. And if a doctor knows they're going to lose their job, they're paid to believe. And they want to believe. Now, the problem is, are the doctors going into medicine for the right reason? And one doctor informed me that the majority aren't. So you might have 60 or 70% of doctors who are there for, the status and the money and being in the club, in which case they're just very determined to stay focused on what they're told in their pharmaceutical education. All right, so these are some of the problems we're dealing with. It's a breach of medical ethical guidelines to coerce people into this drug, because informed consent for vaccination it must be done without coercion, manipulation or pressure. That's the doctor's medical ethical guidelines. It's all violated. And it's a $15 billion profit-making organisation. So you can see why my work, they've heavily tried to censor me ever since I started my research. So getting on to the genetics of the population. We are all individually genetically diverse. you cannot mandate any drug in the population without killing and harming some people. And the point here is that the government doesn't test the drugs with a placebo before they're on the market, and the TGA doesn't have a surveillance system that will pick up causal relationships to tell us the type and number of adverse events that are happening to vaccines. This is how they're getting away with it. Deceptive surveillance and deceptive advisory boards with who's sitting on the conflicts of interest. So genetics and the environment. Now, many of you will have heard from your doctors recently that some of these diseases are caused by genetics, right? Chronic illnesses are not, genetics is only part of the story. You might have a gene, but it can remain dormant until it is switched on by an environmental toxin. And that's what the doctors aren't telling you. This is a very solid area of science, epigenetics, and it's not good enough to tell you it's your genetics that's caused these diseases. That's an absolute fallacy. It is environmental factors switching on the genes that is causing the huge increase in autoimmune diseases and autism, speech delay, allergies, anaphylaxis. And in the past, we knew there was a family history involved, and doctors knew there were contraindications to a person getting one of these vaccines. That's why you went to your doctor to see if you could have a vaccine in the old days. Choice in medications. So genetically diverse populations, the toxin in vaccines affect individuals differently. Okay, so it's not just your individual genetics that will mean that you react differently to someone else around you, but also the batches of vaccines. The batches are all different as well. And some of them will be more toxic than others. And there'll be contamination in the manufacturing process, right? And these things are injected into the bloodstream. Right, so this is why, to protect human health, you can never mandate any drug in the population, and you need to know that a vaccine is a drug, right? And they're not drugs that are made only with organic molecules, right? They have toxins in them that are also active in the body. So chronic illnesses in children 0 to 14 years of age increased in a direct dose-response relationship to the increased use of vaccines from 1990. So whilst you've just heard of the studies of the vaccinated and unvaccinated groups, when governments don't do the appropriate scientific studies to give empirical evidence, you look at the ecological evidence in children. And children in all developed countries, over 50% of children now in every developed country has a chronic illness. Right? And that's what's been skyrocketing since the early 90s, as we started to increase the use of vaccines. Now, that's a direct dose-response relationship, and under the Brad-Hill criteria for causality, that's your strongest evidence that it's the vaccines that's causing the chronic illness, because it's a direct dose response. But what will the government say if we point that out to them? Correlation doesn't equal causation, right? Now that's not science. If you're seeing a correlation, you must investigate it before you tell the public that's safe and effective. So once, as I said before, your fundamental right is your bodily autonomy. Without it, there's no freedom. You lose your quality of life and your enjoyment of life. And that's what people forgot when COVID and when this drug was promoted to them under the illusion of a vaccine. So epigenetics, this is a really interesting piece of information about allergies and anaphylaxis, which we saw skyrocket in the 90s, and all teachers needed an EpiPen by the end of the 90s. Charles Rickett won the Nobel Prize for discovering that vaccines were a causal effect for allergies and anaphylaxis. That was 1913. right? And so it's not like the science isn't there. The science is already there. We know these things. But the government is listening to the lobbyists from the pharmaceutical companies because money is power and they have access to the politicians. So injection of foreign proteins, adjuvants, are known to cause autoimmune diseases. Right? How many of you have heard of people going to the doctor now and they're being told, the doctor's telling them, oh, we don't know what's causing your autoimmune disease. Well, a couple of years ago, these people got an injection of a modified messenger experimental RNA genetic product. So seizures, cancer, they've all been linked to the vaccines. Autism, which is encephalopathy, that's brain damage, right? Your brain, dysfunctional brain. So you've got mild or extreme, and that's why we have the spectrum. And it was virtually unknown prior to vaccination. And if you really wanted to find out, the government would look at the statistics of the number of autistic children that are vaccinated versus unvaccinated. But they say that's private medical information. But that's not a problem when they want to discriminate in the population, is it? During COVID, medical privacy went out the door. But will they look at the vaccination status and tell you the vaccination status of autistic children? Not a chance. Even when they frighten you with whooping cough epidemics, they're not telling you the true statistics of the fact that the cases were vaccinated. So all medical exemptions, which are contraindications, due to genetics have been removed in Australia since 2016. Now, that was a political decision. When Scott Morrison tabled the No Jab, No Pay in Parliament, that bill removed contraindications. They're the genetic predisposition that people have to some of these diseases, called contraindications, and they were all removed, right? So that during COVID, nobody could get those exemptions. And when you know that vaccines cause allergies and anaphylaxis, these things are life-threatening. Heart attacks, strokes, they all went through the roof in young people, right? And turbo cancers, okay? These things have all been linked to the vaccines. So removing the contraindications, because we're a genetically diverse population, that's a breach of medical ethics. Your doctors are breaching medical ethics. Now, can I just say here, we're not having a go at doctors. Can I say that doctors are wonderful when you are sick, when you are ill, when you're injured. But this is preventative health we're talking about, right? Do drugs have a place in preventative health? No. Because you saw from Wendy's presentation, these infectious diseases were controlled through environmental changes and lifestyle changes, and I'll get onto that in a minute. The serious risk was removed by 1950, right? So this is where the wool is being pulled over people's eyes. So now another thing, you're told that you must be responsible for the community good. And yet the government, this is from Terry Nolan, who was the chair of ATAGI for 10 years, and he stated, proving a drug can create herd immunity in the population is neither necessary nor sufficient for a positive recommendation of a vaccine for national immunisation program suitability. No drug is tested to see if it can produce herd immunity in the community. There's no proof of that. But guess what there is proof of? Natural immunity. Natural immunity was created when the serious risk of these diseases was removed. Parents weren't worried in the 50s and 60s of having their children get these diseases because the serious risk, that is hospitalisations and deaths, had been removed through hygiene, sanitation and nutrition and antibiotics, right? So they didn't worry about them getting the disease, and nor should you, because we're living in a developed country with all of those environmental conditions. And that's why you'll never get a pandemic. Public Health 101. Anyone who had studied the control of infectious diseases knew this was a pandemic right from the start. They used mathematical modelling to predict the scary risk of these viruses. None of that happened, and I'll get onto that in a minute. So just a little bit of a timeline as to how we've arrived at this point. In 1986, the US Congress removed all liability for any drug that was marketed as a vaccine. You didn't have to prove it was a vaccine, you don't have to prove it creates herd immunity, you don't have to prove it's safe, and I'll give you another clue. They haven't even tested the childhood vaccines to see if they prevent the disease. That's the empirical evidence you need. What they use is a surrogate antibody titer, right? And so they'll show you some models of antibody titer. But if you look for the actual trial against an infectious disease to see if that modelling is true, you can't find it. It doesn't exist. And it was stated from the Swedish regulator that no childhood vaccine has been tested against the disease to see if it prevents the disease. Like they did with COVID, they didn't test it against COVID to see if it prevented it. That wasn't one of their trial criteria. Right, so it's illusion that they've been creating an illusion for a long time. So governments have claimed for 30 years that vaccines are proven to be safe and effective, and they are tested for 10 years. Vaccine reactions are rare, 1 in a million. You see, if you don't report on them, they're rare. The media doesn't report on them because it's a corporate-sponsored media. Who's funding the media? You see, unfortunately, we do now have a medical industry complex, the government, the pharmaceutical companies and the media. Now, that's not a conspiracy theory, that's a conspiracy. And in my PhD, I've actually described how that works. And it goes back to the World Health Organization and international health policy, and that's how they control the health policies in every country. So governments are now getting directives from a centralised body, and that body itself is advised by the Gavi Alliance, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunisation, which is the pharmaceutical companies. Right, so there's a big link there. So more and more vaccines have been added to the schedule based on these claims, but what if the claims are untrue? So if all those claims are untrue, they're not proven safe and effective, they're not tested for 10 years, we know that they're causing death and illness in the population. The only thing we don't know is what number, right? How many, but around us we're seeing it now with the COVID vaccines, and the childhood vaccines is a tragedy in itself. But that's how you create the illusion. They're saying one thing, but the opposite is actually true. So I did my PhD research in 2015, and of course the lobby groups tried to prevent it from being published on the website, but the university said they support my research because of course it had been internationally examined. What I found was the undone science in government vaccination policy, which is what we've told you about today. No placebos, no 10 years trial, and not even tested against the disease itself. And that is called undone science because it's the empirical evidence you need. What's happening is pharmaceutical companies are funding studies, but they're epidemiological studies. What that means is they can choose the parameters and that affects the outcome that they get. Okay, so and then they the government will say only use the recent studies, and then all the history of how we control vaccines goes right out the door. And that's what's happened. And also, they're not discussing natural immunity. There's other ways of getting immunity than a drug. And as you know, we haven't even got proof that these drugs can cause immunity. But we do know that we have natural immunity. And that's what Novak Djokovic knew he had when he came to Australia. And when he asked for his visa and it was provided to him, he did nothing wrong. And he'd had COVID, so he would have already had the antibodies and was protected with natural immunity. So he was detained for a thought crime. the fact that people might think he's anti-vaccination and therefore follow him. Imagine that. So this is where we're at. Anyway, instead of, when I was seeing all this information, I felt that other people needed to see it, so I started a newsletter, and that was in 2012, and it did end up going global, and I think that's probably one of the reasons why they couldn't just sift my PhD out the door when I finished it, because too many people were watching. And it's now been downloaded 38,000 times, which is an amazing achievement for a PhD. And I'm only saying that because it's information that they didn't want to get out, but I did write those letters, and yeah, it's now achieved 38,000 downloads. And then, of course, I lasted until October 2020 when I was deplatformed on MailChimp, because the CDC bought some shares in it in 2018, so I knew I was being monitored. But I finally put out a newsletter saying, you know, that the cause of COVID-19 has not been provided, you know, and letting everyone know that they hadn't actually systematically determined what was causing COVID-19 disease. So they were changing definitions and all sorts of things to convince you. So when I tried to debate my topic as a university academic, I got attacked by everybody, and my professor stated, "I have studied issues of intellectual freedom for many years. Never have I heard of a campaign against a research student more relentless and abusive than the one against Judy." So there's actually another book in the strategies that have been used to censor this information from the public. And a lot of ridicule and abuse was used, and lies in the media. Wikipedia, you know, on my trip here today, I heard Richard, the fellow on comment, Richard Feidler, saying how independent Wikipedia was. And of course, my Wikipedia is locked, and it's been based on lies and often media articles and things like that. So please be careful with Wikipedia. So one of the big things that has also slotted into place for me, when this complaint of academic misconduct was made about my research in 2014 was the complaint, but my research had been completed in 2006, 8 years prior, on whooping cough. And the research had received a high distinction from the university lecturers. But all of a sudden, an anonymous complaint came in of academic misconduct. And of course, there was no academic misconduct even described in the complaint, and yet the university allowed that to be pushed through, and I had to be investigated through 2015. Well, what I've realised is it meant that my submission to the Senate inquiry into the No Jab No Pay in 2015, not a single politician could read it because of this complaint by an anonymous person of academic misconduct. So, and when I asked the university to put out a press release vindicating my research, because of course that complaint had been put through the media, you know, for a whole cycle, you know, for several days, the university refused. So this is what we're up against. It's corruption. I've also had corruption in the courts, just like Philip mentioned as well, other leaking of affidavits to the media. So this is all being controlled through derogatory name-calling, labelling, association, gaslighting of anybody who does get sick, and ostracism. Human nature is that you don't want to be ostracised or outside the mainstream, and that's what they're working on. They're not trying to convince you with studies, all these studies. You know, you shouldn't need to do a PhD to actually know whether these drugs are safe and effective. And I'll just mention one other strategy that has been used. It came to my attention that in May 2025, Raina McIntyre, who took over as the director from the National Centre for Immunisation Research and Surveillance, that body was run by Peter McIntyre for 20 years. And that's the body that provides the evidence for safety and efficacy of these vaccines. So what she's done is she's put out a book and copied the title of my book, Vaccination. And the purpose of her book was to inform you of what is misinformation on this topic. Now, do you think that's not a conflict of interest? She's a government representative and her job is to provide the science and evidence for the government's policies. Isn't that on the web where you can all be convinced? And if a vaccine works, then we would see the benefits of those vaccines. Why does she have to write a book to tell you how to think and copy the title? Because the only purpose of this is to confuse the public about the claims of safety and efficacy. Do you see? You don't know which studies are right and which have been well designed and which haven't, and even the funding, you can't rely on that. So what they say to you is only get this information from a medical doctor. Rule of thumb. So you're not being convinced on evidence, you're being convinced through heuristics, framing, illusion, lies, and rule of thumb. And it's very effective. You will go to the doctor because there's no one else to rely on. You can't rely on anyone else. And we know that doctors are wonderful when you're injured or sick. But this is preventative health in healthy people. Drugs are not appropriate for preventative health and they're not needed. The government only had this policy from the early 1800s, 1900s, because it didn't involve drugs to control the risk of infectious diseases. So let's have a little look at that. And don't forget that the doctor's education is sponsored by the vaccine manufacturers. They only know what they're told, right? And they're not told the ingredients of vaccines and they're not taught the history of how we control these diseases. So when doctors are educated from industry-funded science, industry-funded conferences, just a little note there. After 2010, I applied to present my work at the Australian Immunisation Conference, and all 5 abstracts for university research were rejected without a reason. Now, what happens there is all the people that attend that conference only see one perspective. They don't realise that several other people who are trying to present different information, they've all been selected out. So that's how you get groupthink. And in the workplace, we now have groupthink because the people that thought for themselves and realised they wanted their bodily autonomy and their quality of life, so they refused to get an experimental drug. And don't worry, Greg Hunt told you it was experimental. He didn't hide that fact. Well, they left their work positions. So there's no one in the workforce, they're too frightened to speak up about the risks because they know they'll be ostracised or even deregistered if they're a doctor, and even told that they're mentally ill. That is also happening at the moment. So this creates an illusion of a consensus of the science because doctors are being paid to believe. Just to confirm that everything we have said tonight is real, this is the RICO law case that was established in January 2026 this year. So essentially, a RICO means the Racketeer, Influenced and Corrupt Organisations Act. And so we have the American Academy of Paediatrics, in collaboration with vaccine manufacturers, are being sued with a federal RICO lawsuit for vaccine safety fraud, right? So Aaron Siri and others, very prominent people, are involved in this case, and it is in the courts at the moment. But we've had success in the Supreme Court in the US before. Del Bigtree won his case proving that the HHS had not done a single safety study in 30 years since the 1986 Act had been put in place to remove liability. But do you know why it didn't have any effect in the population, why you people weren't angry about that? Because you didn't hear it, because the mainstream media won't report on it. Who here has heard of the RICO law case? Just one or two. And that's because you're already into this research. So this is what's happening. When the media doesn't expose the corruption, it continues. And the only strength that we have is people power, and that's not going to work if most of you are still under the surface and not happy to promote this publicly in the workplace and in with your community. So the childhood vaccine schedule has been fully tested and proven safe. That's the claim that they're being sued about. And if you look at the charges, I've actually put the link there, but the charges also have recognised that the pharmaceutical companies are actually designing treatments for the diseases that they know are being created by vaccines. So that's one of the other charges. This business model has been going for a long time, and unless we get a media that's going to tell the majority of people, then we're not going to succeed. So that's racketeering. Now, just so you've got some idea of whose work I'm promoting, it's actually Macfarlane Burnet, who won the Nobel Prize in 1960 for his work in immunisation and the control of infectious diseases. And this is the information that doctors don't know about and that the government is preventing you hearing about by censoring everything that we're saying. So just as an overall picture of what's happening, this is a quote from Professor Fiona Stanley, who won the Australian of the Year in 2003. And she stated in her work that infectious deaths fell before vaccination was implemented. And that was well known in the 50s and 60s. So the serious risk from vaccines was removed, the serious risk from infectious diseases was removed in 1950 in all developed countries, right? That's where you've got your sanitation and nutrition. Now, at that time, doctors did not need to report cases of measles, whooping cough, or flu. So what we're saying is there were still cases there, that's called infection, but people were not getting seriously sick from them and getting hospitalised or dying. Therefore, it was okay because you know what it was doing? Creating herd immunity through natural immunity. And that's why, as Wendy pointed out, you could go to school and the parents were quite happy for you to get the disease because it was either mild or, guess what, asymptomatic. Subclinical. Do you know what that means? It means you're actually protected. It means you've had the infection without any symptoms, but you have immunity to that disease. And in COVID, the pharmaceutical companies reversed that in collaboration with the governments. The directive came from the World Health Organization. They reversed that and told you that an asymptomatic person was a risk to public health. Really? We've lived all this time on the earth and we've never thought of each other as a risk to our public health. And as you saw through Dr. Philip Altman's presentation, the PCR test was bogus. 45,000 cycle threshold was picking up things that didn't mean anything at all. So that's what happened. In all developed countries, infectious diseases were not considered a risk after 1950. Unfortunately, Fiona Stanley started to work for the Telthon Institute. That's the head of the snake, pharmaceutical funding, research, and she became the director. So what I did was I got, in my PhD, I got quotes from all the top public health officials at the time. And this was from Lancaster, Australian, 1956. He said, as causes of infant mortality in Australia, all the infective diseases have been overcome by 1950. They knew that at that time, the only cases were happening in the Indigenous communities in Australia because environmental and lifestyle and nutrition wasn't at the same level as in our communities. And this is the key factor. The context of these diseases has been removed as history has gone on. So just to reiterate, please look at infectious diseases as infection, and then if you get a serious case of the disease, lots of symptoms, it can be serious, as in you might be hospitalised, or you might die from it. But in a developed country, that's very, very rare. And you know, when they told you that COVID was a new coronavirus, in actual fact, even if it was, coronavirus has caused the flu and colds. We had some natural immunity to it before, even if it had mutated. But in actual fact, this was a genetically engineered virus. So there's a lot of things that are not being told to the public, and there's a term for that. You're being educated to be ignorant. It's called agnotology. And by selecting out the data, that's what's happened. I'd just like to mention the case fatality rate, because also flu is only serious to the elderly people and occasionally to very young people, like infants under 2, if their environment's not right or if they've got constitutional problems. It's not a disease that the majority of people would ever be at risk of. So you don't have to worry about the flu. And that's what the case fatality rate is. You look at case fatality, you can't just say an infectious agent is going to be a risk to the entire population. It's usually demographics that are more at risk than others. So just to reiterate, history is being rewritten since 1950. They've allowed the vaccines to take the credit for the control, for the removal of serious risk from these diseases. So vaccines did not control infectious diseases. They weren't the major factor. But some of them might have had some minor role in controlling them, so that's for you people to decide, and you should have that choice. What I'm talking about tonight is mandating these drugs in the population. That's the crime, and that's what was unlawful, right? Herd immunity is a result of natural infection. There is no proof that any pharmaceutical drug can cause herd immunity. And as you saw, they don't even have to prove that to get them on the schedule. Vaccine reactions are not rare. The only thing we don't know is the number and type and frequency that they're occurring in the population. And vaccines do cause autism. Autism is dysfunction of the brain caused by encephalopathy, and everybody knows that vaccines can cause encephalopathy. In 1980, from 1980 to 1990 in Britain, they did the National Encephalopathy Study and proved a causal link, right? But in the early 90s, they reanalyzed that study using different parameters and massaged out that link, then re-educated doctors to not believe that because at that time doctors knew that the whooping cough vaccine was causing brain damage, so they re-educated them to say that this vaccine doesn't cause brain damage, and they brought in the acellular vaccine so that doctors would promote that. And that's how they got away with it. But the whole cell whooping cough vaccine is known to be linked with brain damage. That was the 70s and 80s. So this is called ecological health or social medicine, right? It's not in the government's jurisdiction to mandate drugs in the population. Why are we bypassing the doctors and their medical ethics? We need to get angry about this. We need everybody needs to speak up, because human health is at risk, and we are changing the genetics of society with these policies. Just to clarify, because you'll notice that some people are now saying that viruses don't exist. What I will say is that the government and pharmaceutical companies are using viruses as an excuse for these adverse events that we're seeing in people. So often they'll blame a virus instead of the vaccine that you've recently had. What we do know is that germs will cause disease, but it's a balanced environment that prevents you getting sick. So the agent is necessary, but if your environmental conditions, your hygiene, sanitation, nutrition are good, and your constitution is strong and you're not stressed out, then all these viruses are around us all the time and you won't get sick, right? So it's the environment that makes the difference. But once there's stress or poor health and sanitation, then the agent will reproduce, and that's when the sickness starts, the germs. So Macfarlane Burnett's statement in 1952 was, genetics, nutrition, psychological, environmental factors may play a more important role in resistance to disease than the assumed benefits of vaccines. They were only assuming that the vaccines would be beneficial at that time. And what he said was, in the long term, universal vaccination may not be in the best interest of the race, genetic deterioration of the population. And that's what we're seeing. Autism has skyrocketed, dysfunction of the brain damage. It didn't exist before the 1930s when we first trialled these things in the population. These are the sorts of chronic illnesses we're seeing in children. That's increased fivefold and even more now over the years. I thought I'd put this slide in because this has all been sleight of hand, changes of definitions. They'll use the word immunisation where they mean vaccination, right? Vaccination's the actual act of getting that injection. We don't know that it's going to give you immunity, but if they use the word immunity, then you're going to take the vaccine. So all of these things are deceptive. Imagine a vaccine so safe you have to be threatened to take it, right? Which was the COVID era. And for a disease so deadly, you have to be tested to know you have it. Do you remember the queues of people lining up, no symptoms whatsoever, to get these PCR tests? That's where the cases came from, right? There was no real disease in the community. The only people that died were those in hospital, and that was by reversing protocols. You know, even remdesivir was a black triangle drug, experimental. The antivirals were provisional approval only. Mandatory government vaccination schedules are harming human health and cannot be called a health policy. This is deception. They're sickness policies, right? They're causing harm and death in the community. Look at the NDIS. You know, so much of it is autism. So the Therapeutic Goods Administration then claims it does not have a duty of care to the public. Are you prepared to take a drug that is injected into the body if the government doesn't have any duty of care to the public? Who knew that, you know? Isn't that why public health policies exist, for the community good, right? Now, that's just one other point I want to finish up on, is that if we're genetically diverse, how can a drug be claimed to be for the community good? It's a fallacy. We've fallen for something that doesn't exist. It's sleight of hand, right? So mandatory vaccination, right, is a crime against humanity. The public does not have to comply with the government policy that does not require the precautionary principle. These are untested drugs. They're mandating on the people to be used to protect human health. And when the government has no duty of care to the public, mandating vaccination is an unlawful political, not a medical decision. The doctors haven't been involved, but they're promoting it because their medical ethical guidelines are being violated by their regulator, the corporate Australian Health Practitioners Regulatory Authority. So this is a crime against humanity, as most of you probably know. So all we can do is keep the education going. Whatever the conversation's going, there is hope. So if I could just encourage you all to keep talking with your family and friends. If you know anybody that's about to have a baby, please could you direct them to the Inform Me series. There's the website. National and international experts have been asked to put together this series of webinars telling you, providing you with information on each of the vaccines and an overview of medical ethical guidelines and how the medical industry complex is working. All right, and also doctors, we now have doctors supporting us. So if you need any information to take to your own doctor to educate them, please go to that website, the Australian Medical Professional Society, AMPS, Doctors Lobbying for Patients' Rights. And they've written letters that you can actually take to your own doctor to inform them of the risks of particularly the COVID injections. All right, thank you very much.